Good day, welcome everybody to our fourth installment this semester of the sessions of Territory, Urbanism and the Anthropocene under this specific title of ecology. It's a lecture series initiated by the team Professorship Marc Angélil and myself. And I would like to thank for the organization to Sasha Deltz, Hans Hortig, and Jörg Stovins, brilliant behind the camera. So the question that we are interested in, I would like to point your attention toward the word urbanism, which is perhaps slightly surprising among all the other terms on this poster. Anthropocene, ecology, territory. Urbanism points to the agency of design, of urban space, of urbanization processes. Should our effort as architects be maintained in the future at broader scales, at larger scales, what should be then our main concerns and the main features of our urban project? And clearly with urbanism, I use the term urbanism to capture that broader interest. This is not only urbanism in the sense that we have gotten used to it in the 20th century, a kind of a state-led effort. It does still mean urban design, but it also means urban research, a critical urban research. It means critical spatial practices. It means also activist artistic work that addresses space and urbanization. And also with urbanism, we mean extended effort, effort that broadens our perspective from cities to urbanizing territories or even to planet as a whole. So the problematic of the Anthropocene is captured by this term. So I would like to just remind those of you that are new here that we started this lecture series more than a year ago. And the first year was dedicated to urbanism beyond neoliberalism, where the goal was to consider this broader problematic of, let's say, design agency within territories of urbanization, to say so, in the late 20th and the early 21st century, and to consider how this effort has changed at the time of strengthening of neoliberal ideas and ideologies. Neoliberalism being the principal political economic model at the basis of social organization and the shaping of the built environment. And these are the times where we have seen the shrinking public sector, shrinking state, and as a consequence, the work of architect urbanists being completely reshaped. So we looked from that perspective, political, economic perspective, at implications for our practice. And in this year, we have seen 10 lectures and had 10 speakers and respondents, including Arno Brandelhuber, Jennifer Robinson, and Momoyo Kaima. And this year we are shifting our attention to, let's say, a different force shaping our practice, to say so, the force of ecology. And we will be continuing with the third key term next year. I won't reveal it yet. So I would like to remind you that modern architecture during the 20th century did not bear kind of influence of environmental critique to the extent that perhaps we have the opportunity to integrate it in our work in the present day. Environmental movement in architecture, art, and other disciplines only begins to shape in the 1970s. Example is, for instance, the Club of Rome and their influential report Limits to Growth in the 1972. So we are now, let's say, already 50 years later, but I believe that the kind of conceptual basis of that environmental critique still need to find their way into our urbanistic practice. So I think we should, let's say, better hurry up. And in that effort, we have again invited 10 speakers from, let's say, different positions, different approaches, to help us to consider how the agency of design, and particularly urban and territorial design, can respond to the challenges of the Anthropocene and the necessity, to say so, of the ecological transition. So it is for us a great pleasure to welcome today Anna-Sophie Springer. And let me introduce Anna. She's an exhibition maker, writer, editor, and publisher. Since 2011, she directs a publishing imprint, K Verlag, in Berlin, advertising new forms of publishing under the concept that she calls book as exhibition. She's the co-principal investigator of Reassembling the Natural, together with Etienne Turpin. It is a wide project that Anna will present, and the project that really attracted our attention as highly interesting for our own investigations. This is an exhibition-led inquiry into biodiversity loss and land use transformation, to just put a brief description of that effort. Her research-based practice merges curatorial, editorial, and artistic commitments by stimulating fluid relations among images, artifacts, and texts in order to produce new geographical, physical, and cognitive proximities, often in relation to historical archives. Anna-Sophie is also the co-editor of Fantasies of the Library and associate editor of the 8th Berlin Biennale. She received her MA in Contemporary Art Theory from Goldsmiths College and is currently a visiting lecturer at Institute for Kunst in Basel and a PhD student at the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths, where her research examines the financialization of nature and the role of natural history collections in the time of ecological collapse and mass extinction. And after Anna's talk, I will also introduce our brilliant respondent for today, Dubravka Sekulic. But first, help me welcome Anna-Sophie Springer.
Thank you, Milica, for, is this too loud? Is it? No? Good. Thank you very much for this warm welcome and for the invitation to both of you, Marc and Milica. It's great to be here. And yeah, as Milica said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the collaborative project of mine, Reassembling the Natural, that I started about 5 years ago, actually in Indonesia at the time, and we have then traveled the project over to Germany, and I'll talk through the 3-part exhibition series that came out of that over the last year and a half. So I'll begin by giving a brief introduction to the conceptual background of Reassembling the Natural, and then we'll focus in on that work by through two more concrete examples from the exhibition, which one is from more the zoological realm and one from the botanical. So, the transdisciplinary curatorial intervention under the title Reassembling the Natural, I developed together with my partner and collaborator Etienne Turpin, which I think, as we are here at architecture school, Etienne might be a familiar name through his books, edited volumes, Architecture in the Anthropocene or Art in the Anthropocene, that came out in 2013, 15 respectively with Open Humanities Press. And if you don't know the books, they are open source, available on the internet, highly recommended. So we develop together artistic and curatorial projects that contextualize and counter-read natural history collections by confronting them as an understudied archive of the legacies of European colonialism and ongoing ecological imperialism. And one of our arguments here is that inherited images and narratives of primarily tropical nature, especially those disseminated in traditional museum displays, habitat dioramas, collections, usually don't invite any notions of how these images of nature actually relate to issues of culture. So in their role as artifacts, constructions, cultural assemblages, and what those mean. And that in this way, they also hardly, and this is the crucial fact, resemble a world that is affected and essentially remade by, you could say, accumulation-driven processes on a global scale. In fact, so the economic development of vast territories through deforestation, resource extraction, monocropping, and the attendant eradication of habitat and biodiversity are not among the organizing narratives or topics when you visit any natural history museum. Instead, these displays typically eclipse most notions of human interspecies entanglements, and so likewise plants, animals, and other life forms and their ecologies are usually represented as entirely, you could say, unaffected by economic concerns. So you can see here, this is a traditional habitat diorama where you have no sense of neither human cohabitation with other species nor with the kind of industrial effects on those landscapes. And so while that certainly may look more beautiful, in our work we think that especially given current political and planetary climates, the perpetuation of such images is not merely inadequate, but that they are indeed misleading and detrimental to a public sense of environmental urgency and justice, because, and I give you three brief reasons for this, because on the one hand, they extend Western assumptions of vertical evolution and human exceptionalism. They support conceptions of the environment versus the economy as existing separately from one another, as if there was such a thing as untouched nature, as if there ever was such a thing as untouched nature. And then thirdly, as if you want to borrow Jason Moore's terms, cheap nature was a thing that existed as an infinite bounty that we could tap into and extract from kind of at will and with no consequences. So in response to these kind of observations, Etienne and I came up with a term which we call Necro Aesthetics. And we say that the Natural History Museum, through its taxidermy and habitat dioramas, presents presents nature in a necroaesthetic fashion. That is, it presents these animals as if they were alive, right? But then so you imagine the glass eyes that are regularly polished, so there's no dust, so you have this vivid gaze. So the specimen looks back at you, and you forget the moment of death and kind of refabrication into the animal object when you encounter a specimen like this. And so what does this mean in the Anthropocene? This means that we are confronted with a set of conventional nature images that fundamentally hide natural history's deep and thorough entanglement with economic and colonial enterprises on a colossal continental scale. No? So sometimes you're even encouraged to touch these specimens, such as here. And then if you also imagine that natural history museums, and we can talk about that later, but natural history museums as a public space are populated by families and children. And so what does it mean for children to be encouraged to touch specimens like this in a hall kind of fundamentally of dead objects? And so we wonder if perhaps this kind of relationship creates a more sensual relationship of domination over the rest of the creatures of the earth, if you want to put it provocatively. Now, in their seminal work, such as Green Imperialism or Ecological Imperialism, these older books, Richard Groves and Alfred Crosby, for example, have shown how European colonialism transformed the natural world across the continents. And then in the more recent times, if you think of Simon Lewis and Marc Maslin, and their argument of the orbist spike, they have also pointed to colonial genocide in the Americas as the starting point for the Anthropocene. And yet, the Natural History Museum, as a structure, as an infrastructure, as an institution, differently from ethnographic museums in the landscape of European museums, has not really been considered for the colonial images that it has produced and continues to prolong. Which means that for us, this has, the natural history collection then has kind of emerged as an understudied archive for eco-social violence and the importance of the ongoing legacies of these forms of violence in the present. And so bear this as a kind of brief introduction in mind for what I will continue to talk you through now, which is a much more practical approach to how we work through those questions. And so this is through a 3-part traveling exhibition cycle. In English, the title is Disappearing Legacies, The World is Forest. In German, Verschwindende Vermächtnisse, Die Welt als Wald. And this project draws connections from the collecting journeys of a British naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, who lived from 1823 to 1913. And he traveled for 4 years to Brazil and then for 8 years to Malaysia and Indonesia in the mid-19th century. So we take this traveling history, as a starting point for drawing out connections to some of the social and environmental conditions of these regions today. So, since I don't assume you are necessarily familiar with Wallace, just a brief introduction and then I get back to him. So Alfred Russel Wallace was an autodidact naturalist and a specimens collector who didn't have an academic education. So he was a collector who collected primarily for selling specimens to scientists and museums back in Europe. And he did this on a first trip, as I said, to the Amazon, and then spent 8 years in Southeast Asia from 1850 to 1864. And so during this time in Southeast Asia, he collected more than 125,000 specimens of natural history. So you have to imagine that conventional or less crazy, less manic collectors would have managed to collect 25,000 specimens, and so this is 5 times more. And based on this vast collection, he contributed majorly to the formulation of the theory of evolution by natural selection. So if I had said this is an exhibition that departs from Darwin, I wouldn't have had to give that kind of introduction. And yet Wallace is one of the major contributors to the publication of the theory of evolution. So he was in Southeast Asia, he understands the principles of natural selection, he writes letters to London, and then upon receiving those letters at the Linnaean Society, Darwin, Linnaeus, Huxley then set up the publication of this paper on the left side is the original evolution paper with a text first by Darwin and then followed by Wallace, and then kind of in the historiography of biology, Wallace is kind of retreated to the back. And this is important. I get back to that in a moment. But so the exhibition itself was on view last year at the Zoological Museum in Hamburg, and then this year at the Anatomical Theater in Berlin, Animal Anatomical Theater. And it is currently on view in Halle at the Central Natural History Collections. So Halle is a smaller town in Saxony-Anhalt, not so far from Leipzig. We received for the project quite a major grant from the Federal Culture Foundation in Germany, which enabled us to develop collaborative relationships with, well, we had the relationships with the artists already, but to develop relationships with artists to make new work in response to the collections in the 3 cities, as well as to the historical archive around Wallace. We worked with artists and activists, and we worked with the collection curators at the 3 institutions in preparation of the exhibition. So in dialogue with the curators, we could then select objects and scientific specimens from the collections in all 3 places and integrate them also in our assemblages and displays. And so here you can see how with animal skins such as of a tapir, an anteater, orangutan, or a Sumatran tiger, so this is a vitrine in Hamburg in the first instantiation. This is a very simple but quite effective disruption of the Necro Aesthetic display, in that there is not a finished animal that looks alive on view anymore, but you have these pretty gruesome furs. So the pelt is stripped of the animal body, and this is actually how in the scientific collection furs are kept, or skins. And if you go into the basement of Hamburg, you have these rooms where there's thousands, 10,000s of these kind of fur coats hanging, and we decided to show them like this because it kind of creates a much more distant view, and at the same time a much more vivid space for the imagination. Then if you have sort of the fox that I showed before, you don't have to really think about very much at all. You don't have to ask any questions. But when you look at objects like that, all of a sudden the relationship to these things kind of changes. And so the entire project of disappearing legacies and reassembling the natural as a whole is then designed as an intervention aiming to denaturalize, if you will, some of these inherited necroaesthetic images and conceptions that are put forward in natural history museums. And so in Hamburg, as here you can see, it resulted in a veritable kind of confrontation with the zoological exhibition, because we had to build our exhibition directly into the existing scenario. So we ended up having to project films on the glass of vitrines, for example, as you can see here. This was partly an infrastructural decision because the museum turned out not to actually have an empty gallery for us, but in the end it became a much more engaging possibility for us to really enter there and have not just the 18 installations and assemblages on view, but have these kind of accidental moments of friction or excess in the way that these works worked with everything else that was in the space. And so going back one more time to Wallace, so working with the legacy of Wallace then was on the one hand a pragmatic opener, like a door opener, for being able to begin a quite profound dialogue with the institutions, the curators, and their collections, right? Because we're in a quite conservative territory. And so coming with the option of a kind of a historical protagonist, a historical persona, allowed us to begin a conversation. But then we were not interested in a kind of a biographical retrospective exhibition that celebrates kind of a white male figure of the history of science, not at all, but much rather his very meticulous texts and observations that you can read today, the language is not at all kind of antiquated, so you can read that very well as a starting point for comparisons to the conditions of certain sites today and 160 years ago. So which is then what we did with the artists and activists involved. Retrace some of the places that Wallace visited and studied and look at what is going on there now. So this is in Brazil, as well as in Indonesia. 17,000 islands. Indonesia is huge. And Borneo and Sumatra, for example, are among the 10 largest islands in the world. So vast territory. And kind of before I move into the more concrete kind of presentation of how we did that, I just want to quote a short paragraph from our little catalog, where we ask, how can colonial natural history collections be mobilized, disassembled, framed, and read in ways that enable a discussion of urgent and systemic questions of epistemicide and ecocide today, whether in the Anthropocene, the Capitalocene, or the Plantationocene? Can, and if so, how can, a colonial archive become a point of departure for a conversation about other ways of knowing, reading, and sensing nature? So just in a nutshell, you understand where we are coming from. So in what follows then, I will try to show you how we work through these questions via two exemplary assemblages. One, as I said before, engages with materials of the history of ornithology, so zoology, and one deals with agroforestry and plants and landscape. First, if you remember the first slide, my title, Species of Exchange. So in English, species of exchange describes actually different kinds of currency. So different ways of paying or bartering. Dickering, my other word from the title, is a different word for negotiating, bantering. So currency, different things that can be that have been evaluated, that can be evaluated, and it can be used for trading, either abstractly or as commodities. And this includes land, resources, manufactured goods, or more conventionally, bills and money. But then since I'm not obviously a native speaker in English, I can sometimes use expressions that resonate then with me kind of differently. And so the term of species of exchange for me is a useful concept to study the complicity of natural history collections in the European colonial project. And for example, Jeffrey Bowker in Memory Practices in the Sciences uses a different expression, biodiversity as currency, where to explore the long-standing relationship between nature and value, or natural assets and accumulation, or specimens and commodities. Corey Ross in Ecology and Power in the Age of Empire writes, Europe's empires created institutions and forms of governance that were specifically designed to travel. They applied technical and scientific knowledge that claimed universal validity. Perhaps most importantly, from an environmental perspective, they assembled markets and transport networks that spanned oceans and continents. Trade links were the vital sinews of European empire, and from 1870 to 1940, world trade more than quadrupled. So one group of animals that is richly inscribed with imperial environmental colonial legacies are the birds of paradise, whose bodies were exported to European metropoles in quantities of around 100,000 bird skins at the end of the 19th century. And you see Wallace here trading in the eastern Aru Islands for birds of paradise. So birds of paradise are some of the most extravagant creatures of the animal kingdom. And most of these species are found only in Papua New Guinea, so in the very east of the Indonesian archipelago. And then there are some species in the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, and the Aru Islands, and also in the rainforests of Australia. And Europeans cultivated century-long mythological relationships to these birds, but then it was actually Wallace who first wrote about seeing these birds, observing these birds in their living habitat, so alive. So before that, they were only shipped as dead objects. And then there's all of this kind of fantasy imagination. That's hence the name bird of paradise. There's all of this fantasy inscribed, and then Wallace is the first one to encounter them. And therefore, they are very, very important in his writings, and they're very important if you engage with the history of the study of evolution, because they're so adapted and so unique. Every species is completely different from one another. And so if for us to make a show about Wallace that engages with the history of the Natural History Museum, with the history of evolution, etc., we kind of had to work with birds of paradise. And in Wallace's case, he collected 5, or he kind of discovered for science 5 of the now known 39 species of bird of paradise. And the one that you see here is then named in honor of him as Semioptera wallacei. But so currently is also 100 years since the end of the German colonial empire, right? And so the project that I'm talking about is situated in Germany, 3 German natural history collections. Now 100 years since the end of the colonial empire in Germany, which in Germany just begins to kind of be a thing that people talk about, a thing that is kind of a confrontational topic in the museum landscape. If you're familiar with in Berlin, the Humboldt Forum, it's a huge controversy. But somehow nobody wants to really talk about it. And they say, oh, well, it was just 30 years, not so bad. And actually we did it really well compared to. So hugely contentious, rightly so. But going into the natural history collections, being with the birds of paradise, also then meant for us that as we were reading the zoological names of other birds, so there's Semioptera wallacei to remember Wallace, but then there's all of these other birds, and they all have little labels with names on them. And so what do we read? Paradisea guillermi. Well, what is this? Paradisea guillermi is actually named after the German Emperor Wilhelm II, William II, Guillermi, William. And so then we were asking, why is this? Why is there a German emperor bird of paradise? So in 1884, a secret colonial mission was actually led by an ornithologist to conquer on this map the blue part of Papua New Guinea as a German colony. And the Germans did this as a camouflaged natural history expedition, as an ornithological expedition, but really with the aim to annex this area of later Kaiser Wilhelmsland as a German protectorate in the northeast of Papua New Guinea. And the ocean area around that, in the north of it, is still called today the Bismarck Archipelago. So if you look at the map today, in that area of formerly Kaiser Wilhelmsland, there's still a town called Finchhafen, so Port of Finch, named after this ornithologist who stuck the German imperial flag into New Guinea. Yeah, so you can go actually into the ornithological collection, and by opening the drawers, you don't have to really bring anything at all. But by opening the drawers, you have all of that history right there. You have all of the names right there, and you can kind of therefore reassembling the natural as a kind of socio-economic, socio-cultural construct. You can tell that through this lens of colonial legacies quite easily, and then in a traditional institution such as natural history museums. That's kind of what we did. So Germany then founded a trading company in 1882 that was majorly managed by German bankers and trading companies who were situated mostly in Hamburg, so major German colonial port. And the goal was exploiting natural resources from the region of the Bismarck Archipelago to the German Empire. So tropical woods, fertilizers, rubber, tobacco, copra, cocoa, rubber, and so on. And so here now you have the Prussian emperor with the emperor bird right next to it. Here's another bird of paradise, Pardisea rudolfi, who is named after the Crown Prince Rudolf. And Hans, you told me you're from Austria, so this is the Crown Prince Rudolf of Habsburg, Austria. And this bird was actually named as such by Adolf Bernhard Meyer, who was also an ornithologist, but he happened to be Wallace's lifelong translator into German. So as we were making the exhibition, we were looking how did Wallace's writings, how did they travel to the German-speaking world? And this was primarily done through the translations of this Mr. Meyer, who directed the Royal Zoological Museum in Dresden at the time. So this is the 1880s, 90s. And so, for example, he called then this little bird the Pardisea alberti. So this is named after the King of Saxony, so his boss, the founder of the Royal Museum in Dresden. Then Meyer also invented actually this new type of glass and steel vitrine in the 1890s, which in archival papers is referred to as the Dresden Case, which you see an advertising of on the slide here. And it happened that in the Berlin venue of the exhibition, the Dresden Case is actually permanently installed. So again, we had to deal with historical vitrines, intervene into this kind of setting. And this brings me to actually talking about a first artwork by Revital Cohen and Tur van Balen, who is an artist duo in London who we worked with. And the intervention that Revital and Tur developed is in direct response to a historical bird vitrine with bird specimens that were collected by Meyer, so by Wallace's translator. And the artists visited a private collector of taxidermy in his house, and x-rayed the vitrine. You can see the x-ray image on the other side. And then they constructed, based on the kind of the wire shapings on the inside of these bird specimens, so back to the Necro Aesthetic, back to the kind of the animal artifact constructed object. So they used the shapes of the wire interior of the birds to create these neon, very, very fine neon sculptures, which are filled with rare earth minerals from the area of the Bismarck Archipelago, where currently there's a lot of deep sea mining happening in that area. So we have a kind of a neo-colonial situation happening in that region. And the artwork by Revital and Tur kind of makes that arc, well, very subtly in these layers from the collection of the birds through the naming of the birds into the vitrine, out into the Bismarck Archipelago. And then situated here, you see it in the Hamburg skeletal hall. So, as I said, Bismarck Archipelago now very important site for rare earth mining. And this is another work by Lisa Rave. If you ever have the chance to watch this film, Europium, it's highly recommended. She deals with the legacies of mining in the area of Bismarck Archipelago. Then another work that kind of came out of that dialogue about Bird of Paradise is a photographic series by an Indonesian photographer, Aro Bayuwaji, that you see here. And so Indonesia is one of the largest producers of plastic waste in the world. And he was really struck by the comparisons of the writings of Wallace and others describing the birds in the trees, and they do their mating dance, and it's a very beautiful little spectacle. And then by walks on the beaches, he was really reminded when he saw kind of this scene of that, but in a sort of, well, in a kind of perverse spectrum of friction. So we show those as well. And then to jump to another species of exchange, that's obviously the oil palm, or Elaeus guinensis, that I think you probably all are quite familiar through Milica's and your team's work here. And so the oil palm in Indonesia follows directly into the legacies of economic botany, or colonial useful plants, as they're called. So you could think of rubber and cinchona, quinine, that were more popular in the 19th century. And then now in the 20th and late 20th and 21st century, Indonesia, followed by Malaysia, is the world's largest exporter and producer of crude palm oil, which is used in most manufactured commodities that we consume, as well as in biofuels, in huge quantities. And so the image here, for example, is from Buitenzorg Botanical Garden. So on Java, still exists a botanical garden, which used to be the oldest and most important bioeconomic research facility in Southeast Asia during colonial times. And plants from South America were exported and planted on Java in early plantations and kind of experimented with in terms of scaling them up to plantation scale. Yeah? And so today we end up with more of those experiments in regions such as Riau or in Sumatra or in Borneo, where you have peatland soils, highly carbon saturated, extremely valuable kind of soils, not very useful for oil palm. But I bring this up because if we want to discuss the Anthropocene and the modern human realm, then there is, of course, this twin term of the plantationocene that Haraway and Anna Singh, for example, use sometimes. And they use it not only to talk about the plantation as such, but as a means to kind of address the entanglements of simplified ecosystems. So to talk about plantations as reproduction machines, to think about monoculture plants and the proliferation of monoculture plants, but also to address histories and legacies of slavery, genocide, and extinction, or the effect on a rich kind of biodiversity. And so what we did in the exhibition context then was develop a collaboration also with the botanical collection, the herbarium in Hamburg, and produce this kind of selection of colonial plants that were moved through the port of Hamburg from the colonies in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia, and then experimented with in the botanical gardens in Hamburg, but also the stock exchange in Hamburg had a kind of a smaller dependence of the Botanical Scientific Institute directly integrated into the stock exchange, so that import, export, and science were handled as kind of a very close entanglement directly on site. And so with the installation and with the conversations that we developed around this installation of colonial useful plants, of historical plant specimens, we then try to kind of address that history of plant botany in its direct relation to the plantation. And then in the exhibition, itself, through a lot of the artworks, the plantation and oil palm complex is addressed in many different ways. So one example is a 90-minute film that we did with Armin Linke, photographer that you also might be familiar with. We traveled with Armin and Julia Bruno for about a month in Sumatra, Borneo, and Java, and interviewed probably 20 very different stakeholders around the oil palm complex. And then if you know Armin's film work, older work, he has this incredible amount of footage, but then his interlocutors maybe end up having a sentence or two as a statement in the Anthropocene Observatory, for example. So everything gets cut down to these very, well, cinematic kind of statements. But then working on the oil palm, he kind of changed his methodology so that the film is so long because all of the different interlocutors get a lot of time to describe their various kind of relationships to the situation of oil palm proliferation in Indonesia. So there's plantation workers, indigenous activists, there's representatives of oil palm companies at a forestry fair where they show us the machines and tell us how fantastic it is for the economy. And of course, it's very complex, it's very complicated because in Indonesia, the country's economy is based now financially on that kind of metabolization of forest ecology into monoculture, into commodity, or crude oil that gets exported and then manufactured into commodities, right? So it's a very tricky conversation. And sometimes if you want to ask, well, what do you as foreigners do here? But sometimes it's quite conductive to come in as a foreign agent. Same with the Natural History Museum and that kind of possibility of using Wallace as a door opener. Sometimes it's good to have sort of mechanisms or possibilities for initiating a conversation and then talk with, Anna Singh calls it a kind of a polyvocal, get kind of a polyvocal discussion going. So with Armin's film, that's an example of that. And then here you see in Hamburg, we projected it directly on one of the vitrines again. And so you have this donkey's ass sticking out on one side and conversations that would occur here that where somebody might say, oh, I've never actually noticed this vitrine as a vitrine. And now I see. And now I see it as a device. Now I see it as an apparatus. So that happened there as well. Another project, very important project, are these images by the Academy Drone Indonesia, led by an activist geographer from Java, Rajawali Irendra, who builds drones in community workshops out of various materials. And then they do workshops on piloting drones. You can see that here. And so they produce aerial imagery of landscapes that are affected by illegal land grabs, illegal mining, etc. Here you can see the oil palm proliferation. And then these images are partly being used sometimes as evidence in court, where communities defend themselves, represented sometimes by environmental organizations, WALHI, for example. And in the exhibition, we show these works directly in opposition with the herbarium specimens that I showed you before. So for example, and then going to Brazil, two examples from Brazil. Maria Teresa Alves, who's an artist from Brazil based in Berlin and Naples, was very interested in working with us in the context of the project. And she planned to make a single channel film project where she went to the westernmost province of Brazil, Acre, and she spent 1 month with these indigenous activists who are all individual chiefs or leaders of different groups living in Acre, all have different languages, and they meet once a year to spend 1 month as forest defenders, where they teach and share themselves and each other about practices of defending their land and their life and their kind of their cultures. And so she said she was going to make a single channel film out of this. And she came back from Brazil and she said, no, I have made 34 interviews and I'm not going to kick nobody out. They are all very important. I'm also not going to cut them. I want to show them all. And so then we were put in front of that question of, well, as a curator, you have to think about the money, you have to think about the technical infrastructure. But so we negotiated her to 19 channels. And so some of the videos are played after one another. And what was so remarkable, or what is so remarkable about this work, is that it also has loudspeaker sound. So there's an enormous presence of completely different kinds of knowledges of living with the forest, living in the forest, having an epistemological and ecological kind of sharing of a reality that is based on a completely different value set, but not entirely, in the sense that, of course, indigenous folks are not antiquated or backward, are not using technology. They have all of these films now available to send with WhatsApp to one another and to share in all of the technological kind of frameworks you can imagine. But here they are speaking to us and sharing with us kind of their view. And in the context of, now I don't have an image from the Zoological Museum in Hamburg, but just as a side note, of course, in the Zoological Museum, putting non-Western humans into the museum, where they used to not even be considered humans, namely, is very contentious, is very complicated. And so when Maria Teresa first said, I'm going to have this 34 indigenous chiefs here, and I'm going to put them right next to where these monkeys are and where the tigers are and so on, we were first a little bit just careful, but then later decided that that's an absolutely strong, and it worked. It was an absolutely strong statement in that kind of dynamic of building a dialogue and building a provocative dialogue. So the last example is an installation in a project by Paulo Tavares, who you might also be familiar with. He's an architect based in Brazil. And he works with this notion of the forest as ruin. So coming back to Milica's introduction of the urbanism, that's why I wanted to close with Paulo's project. So Paulo addresses the forest, Amazonia, as a ruin of colonized civilizations. So whereas in the Western colonial discourse, forest is always equalized with the wilderness, there's no humans there, there's very little humans there, we don't even call them humans, yeah? And Paulo, now, he's not alone. There's a long legacy of anti-colonial research going on, digging into the soils and kind of addressing the destroyed and the genocidal kind of histories that are inscribed into those landscapes. But what Paulo does is he analyzes the botanical footprint of landscape according to plants, to trees, palm trees, fruit trees, that then function as the ruins of former villages in the areas. Because the argument is that the forests have not just kind of proliferated wildly, but that they're very carefully cultivated scenes of human and modern human cohabitation. And so Paulo developed this project together with a group called the Chavante in Mato Grosso, where they mapped the territory that was taken from them. So here's the elders of the communities that were children at the time, in the 50s, when the Brazilian government came into the area and they were expelled, violently expelled. So the elders mapped the territory, and then together with Paulo, they have written a petition for UNESCO and the Brazilian equivalent of UNESCO, and put the petition forward to register this land not as a nature protection zone, where in the Western conservation discourse, again, you have a problematic relationship to the human in the nature, but no, not as a nature protection zone, but as a cultural heritage. So this is super, super radical, to kind of twist all of those notions and invert those notions around. And why we are very happy with this project is because, sure, we make an exhibition, sure, we develop all of these these rooms, but at the same time, with that project, the budget that we could push towards Paulo and the Chavante then has attraction and has an immediate impact in Brazil, in the community, and kind of goes on. So that was the starting point for getting this project going, and they're working on that through the 3 instantiations of the exhibition, and they're continuing to work on that. So I encourage you to look up Paulo's work. It's really, really interesting for landscape architects and architects interested in nature and urbanism, I suppose. And so, yeah, so why did I share those things with you? I show you this because, and we do this work, and would be interesting to maybe bring that into the discussion, but because we think it's super, super important to really work together, so that emperor birds and macho ferns, which I didn't even mention yet, so emperor birds and macho ferns should not be those who have the last word about what it means to live and what it means to be alive and what it means to be a species or multi-species, right? But so we try to kind of develop more sensitive and demanding relationships, I suppose, and challenge institutions to other kind of forms of representation with and of the world. Or then you could say to design, how do we design institutions that would enable a more collective reconfiguration of what representation is possible? And then with the aim to kind of perform a coexistence that essentially is more just to the reality of our co-becoming with kind of the more than human, and a kind of larger and more complex world, versus the sort of what Vandana Shiva says, the monoculture of the mind, right? And so just as a little star, Macho Ferns. So the Macho Fern is the only species of plants that can live in the oil palm monoculture. And it's called Macho Fern. This is the historically botanical anglicized name, which I thought was remarkable as a kind of a true metaphor. Okay. And if you make it to Germany before Christmas, the show is on view in Halle, Saale, at the Zoological Collections. And it's the last part of those 3 parts. There's also the catalog here, which you can download as a PDF from the link there. And the Halle version, which I didn't have any pictures of, is really quite interesting as an instantiation, because it's not a public museum, it's a scientific building that is pre-renovation right now. It's a former GDR. The building is from the 19th century, so you have 19th century architecture, then you have 1930s. For example, the roller blind mechanisms are still from the Nazi time. And then you have this GDR. Sometimes it smells of GDR still in the rooms through the different floor, which I love that. And the rooms are sort of pre-renovation, so they empty offices where we could put the exhibition inside. And now as audience, you get to the door, and then you're just released into this building and can explore this whole crazy, it's like a haunted house. And so again, like in Hamburg, the project works directly with this site. And so each time we had to develop how to deal with the site. No? So not as a white cube, clean situation. So that's from me, and then I look forward to responses, to discussion.
So let me also thank you, Anna, for a great talk, very inspiring, very provocative, very brave, very important. work, and I welcome Dubravka and also all the friends and ETH alumna, so to say, not almost. So Dubravka is an architect originally from Belgrade who was a PhD student at the ETH for 3 years at the GTA, doing a very important work on basically reassembling histories of the former socialist Yugoslavia. And this work will culminate in a PhD soon with the Professor Philip Ursprung. Dubravka is now visiting professor at Institute for Contemporary Art in Graz, working together with Milica Tomic. I see Marc joining in the audience. We have a fourth chair here.
Three muses.
Great. So, so just to start off the discussion before I pass to Dubravka, I see that your work challenges the kind of conceptual basis of nature history museums. These are also, I think, architecturally hugely interesting typologies because they are also under pressure to be more commercial, to be more public, to receive larger audiences. For instance, in Switzerland, there was recently a very prestigious architectural competition for a nature history museum in Basel. So there will be a new building by a large building by a large office, and so these kind of new conceptions of history are under pressure, I would say, from many sides to be reinvented. And I think a different force is also technology and the kind of communication and the way we, discuss any type of historical material today. And I think it's really refreshing to not just refreshing, it's also somehow terrifying, and it obviously your work provokes many emotions. But I'm curious, you have proposed, let's say, challenging concepts within, let's say, the nature history institutions, right? So the work was also welcomed by the host institutions who are probably then looking to reinvent their practices, right? Who are aware of some kind of impasse with their, let's say, presentation of natural histories, right? So I'm interested in just your reflection. How do you think that in those three institutions where you put up the exhibition, how this kind of reflection might help in let's say, reassembling their collections, or their work in the future?
No, great question, yeah. So I'll start with Hamburg, because it's just as you said, natural history museums have to reinvent themselves, and they have to kind of show in this contested times, they have to show that they are not as ossified and kind of as infantilizing and as kind of flat as certain people, many people now are capable of saying. So in the Hamburg context, and I just, even camera is on, but I'll use this as a more informal space now. So in Hamburg, the director of that institution is actually planning to build an entirely new natural history museum at a different site. He wants a fancy kind of, he's a snail scientist, and he loves the Guggenheim, the snail. He loves IMP, German Historical Museum in Berlin, which is also the snail shape. He would love a snail-shaped natural history museum, and the natural history museum for the 21st century. The title is going to be the Evolutioneum. Yeah. And he's also the Wallace biographer in Germany. So we met him in the context of our research on Wallace. And I tried to say this in the lecture before, Wallace was a convenient conversation starter. And it's a fascinating figure, a really multifaceted, very political character. So you can learn and talk and research a lot through this person. But then there was this horizon of a new natural history museum for the city of Hamburg. In Hamburg itself, the collection, the building was bombed in 44, I think. And so the site is kind of under-representational at the moment. And so then there come we with this Wallace character, possibility of an exhibition. And so there's a dialogue, of course, with an institution that a kind of sharing of interests, but then we pretty quickly escape that set of terms and do something much more bolder, I would say. And it is well received because scientists understand the very crucial ecological implications of the oil palm complex and other things like that in the world, climate change, ocean acidification. They know that, they are terrified by that, and they're all looking for ways of how to address that in stimulating ways and how to make connections. And then there's the question, how do you deal with children? The space is essentially a children's museum. So how do you deal with the younger generation that is going to have to live with these kind of realities? And how do you stop creating these kind of when I say again, infantilizing flat images that stimulate no kind of sense of implication, of complicity that is already there. There's no question about it. So how do you turn that around? And we were lucky to find 3 institutions that were really open to hosting us in that way, and who I think want to make a very bold contribution to that discussion. So in Berlin, the Humboldt Forum is a problematic new museology that is in emergence. And so again, the director that we were working with is in very close proximity. Part of the Humboldt University collection is going into the Humboldt Forum, and his institution is managing that. So there was a very keen interest in working with us to kind of push, and we are independent curators, right? So we can be these little scapegoats who can ask these more friction creating questions, I suppose, than if you are inside of the institution. So it's a productive relationship. And in Halle, again, similar kind of set of questions.
Thanks. I was really happy when I got an email from Milica asking me, can you come and respond to Sophie's talk? And I was like, yes. Because I've been, Sophie and I know each other from Twitter, actually, initially. So we've been following each other's works and engaging in the conversation. And there are really a lot, like Twitter is this medium which has a lot of bad reputation, but in my personal experience, it can also be a really great conversation starters and creating this kind of alternative public, kind of counter public, where some of these things that we are all interested in, which is also challenging some of the canons within which we are constantly having to operate without sometimes even having the outside with which we can start to see them as canons that are stifling and problematic, actually worked through. And then I was really happy that I could see this exhibition both in Hamburg and in Berlin. So I was anticipating, so I knew about the exhibition. So last year, this time when I went to Hamburg, I was like, this is so great. So I'm really now I'm fangirling. So okay, I stopped fangirling. And what I really liked, and this is something I only now when you're talking started to think about, is how one is obvious, you're bringing this discourse into the institution and everything, but there is a lot of smuggling going on in a really subtle way in which every title refers to a certain set of authors or potential alliances and co-conspirators and complices with which, and that that a lot of these issues that you were showing around the museum and everything is about the construction of imaginary. And how we are also stuck within the construction of imaginaries, and then we often have this, like, I have a feeling now it's almost daily I hear quoted Jameson, who says it either appropriate, attributed to Frederick Jameson or to Zizek, we can more easily imagine the end of the world than the end of the capitalism, so that there is also the crisis of imagination of way outside, but we don't think of Natural History Museum as a site of production of this crisis of imagination necessarily, because it's so naturalized. So one thing that I was really thinking, okay, there is also a Le Guin in the title. There is, like, in a way, there is like the world as forest, the word for a world is still a forest. So there is Latour. There are all these, you also bring sometimes even unexpected people into this conversation, how this is suddenly helping us discern not only which imagination we need to challenge, but also pointing to what are these imaginaries. And I think that there is also this point in which when I was in the exhibition in Hamburg, which was really intervening within this exhibition, I realized, and I went on Saturday, so the museum was completely full with children. I realized how just without them even understanding what is this new layer that has been added, just because it looks differently, it created some kind of a confusion. That all, like, one vitrine is full of taxidermied orangutan, which looks so anthropomorphic that you are wondering how can this be exhibited this way. And then all of a sudden there is no its friend next to it, but there is a projection of, I can't remember which work. So how much of this is, how much is intentionally that you want to create this kind of distancing effect when intervention, that this friction is also some kind of a distancing effect in which you don't necessarily say to the institution or to the audience, you have to think about it, but you just defamiliarize the setups so much that one has to think about it, because all of a sudden the familiar setting becomes. And is this also a kind of a tool to start thinking together in public, or to make these things public, to take a cue from Latour?
So many things.
Yes.
So many things.
I
Now I wish I
apologize.
had, no, that's great. I just wish I had a pen and could have written these points. So I have to, I'm just going to kind of grab for things. So one thing that I was thinking is, I'll get there, but so we don't make a great distinction between theory and practice, right? So we're researchers and writers, but sometimes we put these things into the space. Other times we make a book and then we call the book as an exhibition. So already we are playing, or we are challenging extremely the sort of conventions of methodical frame, first of all, I would say. We take also, I'm a translator too, so I take the experience of thinking from one language into another also over into the space. So those kind of methodological, maybe it's a bit meta, but you get it, and I hope you get it. Another thing is that then when you work like this, you don't know who's your audience, and you don't have an ideal reader or reader-viewer that you do the work for. So there's a 5-year-old, and then there's a professor, and they're all going to have to kind of, you want them all to be able to engage and be invited, because they are all meaningful contributors to your conversation. So that's when it's handy when these things are kind of like multi-stable figures, because then you can move through them in so many different ways, in more ways than as makers, and I mean we all know this, more ways than as the author. you kind of can anticipate. And that's when it becomes interesting. So for example, having the project in Berlin for 4 months meant that so many people passed through the city and came to see the show and engaged in the conversation, and they brought their work. And I'm sure if you had come and we talked about palm oil and your work, and it all of a sudden this place gets another layer or gets another corner, or we come around another door. And that's, I think, why we make this work precisely. Because that's when there's kind of more to it. And that's also, and then you can talk about collaboration. That's when it becomes really serious, that you think about working together differently than having your singular kind of position. And if you do that seriously, it really means that things become a bit less stable. And then on the meta, taking that back to the meta level with Fantasies of the Library, this book we did a few years ago, which addresses, well, what is classification? What is objective knowledge versus all of the subjective, if you want to call it that, other practices of engaging with material, engaging with the world, of understanding the world, of making meaning. And so in the library project, we started working with what is a collection? And why do we collect? And what does it mean to kind of put the whole world or the whole universe into a room? And what does it mean to take bits out of that and reassemble that and put that together and put it in front of somebody else who can then talk to it? Yeah? So I don't know if that's the answer you were, but I think it's just a very animated kind of thing to be doing, and it's inherently open to encounters. And that's a political moment, because that means that you need a vast variety of possible encounters. You don't want the monoculture, because then it's really boring, right? And so I think that's that.
I have more, but I should not monopolize.
You are responding. Yes.
Yeah, but this is great because you gave me a great cue, and I was thinking, like, you end your text coexisting, which I know was assigned to you to read before this session, so read it if you didn't. You end by quoting Isabel Stenger's an introductory notes to on an ecology of practice, which is one of my favorite texts, and she ends this text by saying that ecology, in her way, was for her a tool for thinking when working with physicists, and the concept of ecology. And she says physicists feel weak and they protect themselves with the weapons of power, equating their practice with claims of rational universality. And this is almost as if someone described urbanists and architects. Mm-hmm. But I think that actually a lot of, not only urbanists and architects, but actually a lot of these professions that went through the boundary work process of a defining profession in the 19th century, in which we are now stuck, because they were ultimately defined through the view of one really limited subjectivity of white men, who feels the world as his to take. And stuff.
Emperor birds and Macho Ferns.
Yes, Macho Ferns. And so is this also, like, how consciously is this also the way that you want to challenge this idea of the professional knowledge and expert, and who gets the right, who has the right to define what is the theory, what?
No, for sure, totally. Not to say it's all about the dilettante, but it's about opening in the sort of, I mean, in the Natural History Museum, you have conservation discourse. You have the question, what is a species? Like very basic questions that once you start looking and who's defining that and what are the power structures that develop from here, namely, then we end up at human exceptionalism, and we can go through to white supremacism from there. Huh? So there's questions of environmental racism that we can address once we get to what are the disciplines and what are the power structures that are kind of innocently inscribed here and not addressed, and what do we do once we open that up and put it on the table, and with the kind of with this very subtle bird project, it's something where we're trying to do that, where we're trying to bring those masculinist power structures into the space, or just say they are already here. And now what do? Let's kick this out, or kick it around a little bit, or a lot, and build other kinds of relationships, definitely. And so sometimes we say we ourselves, Etienne and I, practice an undisciplined discipline, because it's not about sort of just doing anything. It's very rigorous, and it's very careful in the sense what you said, how a title puts out a line to here, and how that line connects to there. And we work very carefully that all of these things are kind of strongly in a set of connections. So it's not random, but it's undisciplined. Yeah.
Many questions. I would also have many questions. I will choose one, which will shift us to a bit of a different perspective. So of course, it is absolutely clear that your project, in its current shape and effort, has to address the kind of decolonizing natural history, right? And this is the key moment, and this is why your protagonist is Alfred Wallace, and why the sites are South Asian. And part of Malay Archipelago. I want to ask you if you would run your project, let's say in Europe and about Europe, about Germany, about German relationship to its own, to say so, nature, right? What would be the features of that project, right? Because I'm curious, how that might pan out, because I think we still, I think the kind of a way in which we debate Anthropocene, again, there is a certain kind of this dislocation of let's say, field of action, right? The wilderness is somewhere remote, right? And indigenous people are somewhere very remote, and palm oil is produced elsewhere, etc., etc. And we are here in this kind of a urbanized world where some relationships are maybe stable, or at least this is the kind of perception. And however, for instance, there was recently a case, and I was trying desperately to remember while you were talking, the NGO group who offered, I believe, 1 million euros to buy a forest from the German energy company. That is one of the ancient forests in Germany that is owned by the energy company, who has the right to mine coal there, right? So there are important battles at our doorstep, and I wonder how you could imagine, let's say, unpacking the project also perhaps as a more close to home, right? That would be my question.
Good question. One way in which we already did this in that context is that we did look at Hamburg as the port of colonial trading, where all of these materials came in and are still coming in, and kind of entangle that as well, make it a local project. Exactly, not make it a project of, very far away, because then again, how do you make that relationship and how do you bring it home? It's already there. And in Hamburg, that's very paradigmatic. So we did that. I think in my PhD work, I'm going to address that much more deeply still. But then we are now doing a new project. It's not in Germany, but it's in Canada. A new exhibition project that we entitled Nature Colony. One word, like Haraway's Nature Cultures. So again, it's an appropriation and with a kind of a twist. And so we are looking at how is nature and ongoing colonialism in Canada, because Etienne is Canadian, so then that's, if you want to deal that way, it's quite close. So, right? It's his own kind of working through the culture. But so how does colonialism produce nature in the Canadian context? And then, as you know, Canada being one of the world leading countries in the mining sector. So not just in Canada, but also in the Bismarck Archipelago, in Congo, everywhere. And so we are now kind of drawing these connections from the history of Canada's colonization over the 150 years to now, historically as well as in a contemporary context. And then again, working with scientists at the University of Toronto who are doing different projects to kind of produce resilience against climate change. So if that's assisted migration of the Douglas fir trees, where they say in 60, 70 years from now, the trees will not no longer be able to grow down here, they have to be further north. So we are assisting the migration of these trees, and then we are asking critically, what does it mean to, from an anthropocentric perspective, to move those trees in order for the wood to be harvested in 60 years. It's not to make the trees have a good life, it's to be able to build houses in 60 years, right? Yeah, so that's a project that we are currently developing precisely to be kind of closer to home, because we also think that those questions, you can kind of ask them anywhere. And it's interesting to do that in a place where you have to challenge your own vision much more strongly because you're so familiar. The moment of your defamiliarization to yourself is perhaps more challenging. So we're doing that now for 2019.
Fantastic. We just, a couple of days ago, we had something very interesting here, a map of the tree of heaven, the Godbaum, the tree of heaven and urbanization. So there was a map of this tree, which students brought it, and the way it kind of colonized the Swiss Mittelland, right? And the tree is where from? Do you remember, Marc? Exactly. It's from, I can't remember. It's probably Vietnam, something like that. China, exactly. And it's likes apparently living close to infrastructure, close to human settlements, because it's warmer, right? And it's a very urban tree which has a better climate. So it's a kind of a migration of species is a fantastic way to rewrite completely the kind of landscape, our perception of landscape. Okay, Toby, it's your turn again.
Okay. I'm also wondering, when do we open it to the
Yeah.
Okay, after but this is also taking a bit of a cue from like also in a way trying to answer also Milica, what Milica asked you, but also like you started with you mentioned this as almost one of the basic things you take for granted, but I think this is still something that needs to be unpacked, for that everybody starts to take for granted that the nature as a concept does not exist until 19th century, when we start to constitute this as something that we need to exploit in order for capitalism to kind of to include it as the other that then needs to be included into the, and how, for example, I always have to remind myself that the quintessential English landscape does not exist until the Enclosure Act starts, where actually most of the people working the land as commons get kicked out, and then you get this quintessential nature, which is the other. And then you also get the idea that human is exceptional. And you write a lot, and there is also this kind of idea of multi-species and companions, and how do we really think ourselves, not as part of not as exceptional other, but as actually someone. Because, and where is then the role, for example, of interior in all this? Nicola Twiley just recently had an article in New York Times in which she said that interior biome became larger than exterior and urbanized, which means that our apartments are now much more biodiverse than the street. Yet we don't think, as we think as nature as the concentration of biodiversity, then it means that my living room and bedroom in Graz may be more nature than the hill I see around the corner, where they are actually growing kind of pine trees for Christmas tree. So how does interior at a certain point in this context plays a role in what your research?
Well, actually, you have the interior space, and then you have the urban space, and then you have the, what do you call it? The no, but Milica calls the agrarian, the rural, not rural, but the proto-urban. What do you say? Peri-urban, because so it gets metabolized into the urban sphere. But then in the urban sphere, where you have less pesticides, you have more insects than out in the field. Germany is also just one big monoculture. And there's since I was born, there's 70% less biomass of insects now in the rural sphere. So you have the interior sphere of the city, where evolution kind of plays out very intensely, and where all the species that live in the cities are now changing to be able to coexist with us. And beyond the city, they don't have such possibilities so much, no? So that's something which then working in collaboration with the scientists, for example, is very interesting, because that's things that they actively study. And then there's conversations that came up by learning with them and bringing that into the project, for example. Yes, I think you're thinking of the coexistence text with the little story of the houseplant, for example. Sure. Houseplants are another fascinating field where you can study the travels of ecosystems, the forced travel of ecosystem around the world, and then these sort of post-natural habitats of our intimate spaces, no? Yeah. Questions from?
Thinking of my geranium that I got as a present from friends here, which traveled, through.
But then the other thing that I makes me think of this, just this little, is cooking sections were here, right?
Yes.
And they have this amazing project about another native is invasive, because this discourse of the invasive species is also, it's so political, and in terms of the kind of the new meaning of borders in our societies, this discourse is not to be taken lightly, that we, in the ecological realm, we talk about species as invasive species, as aliens, the invasion of the Japanese knotweed, etc. All of these very violent terms of, here's the enemy, the other enemy that's going to destroy our authentic world, which, so that just as a...
Good. Well, thank you very much, Anna-Sophie, for your presentation, and thank you for this fascinating discussion. I would like to return to Milica's introductory remarks about the agency of design of architecture, urbanization, of urbanism. You used the term urbanism, of territorial constellations. And I would like to learn from this discussion now to what we do as designers. Obviously you are designing exhibition and books, and there is a clear agenda behind it, deconstructing established notions of how we perceive nature, whether within society or particularly in museums. How do we do this bridge to the disciplines that are out there trying to create our world? Okay? The world that we inhabit beyond museums. And obviously this will be the theme, next week when we talk about sewage systems in the favela, and then when Sandra Bartoli comes, when she talks about the integration of and the construction of nature within the city and the Tierpark, for example, in Berlin. But let's try to work on this step, because this is where we'd like to go with our sessions.
Absolutely, yeah. So I knew that Marc was going to say this, so I kept my part B question, as a footnote to Marc's question. So here it is. So there is sometimes there is a kind of a demarcation line drawn in social sciences between the work that is critical and that is propositional, to say so, right? There is one kind of effort is to construct a critique, and another kind of effort is to construct a kind of a political program agenda, right? For intervening in a certain kind of process, right? And I'm curious. I was, for instance, I was very. I would like to ask how that, linking to Marc's version, how that how those agendas are organized in your project. Because, for instance, knowing that you collaborate with forensic architecture, Eyal Weizmann, Paulo Tavares. So there are several architects, right? So there are people who are concerned with the projective moment, right? With the way that the work will create a kind of a tangible knowledge that will be used, no? That will lead to sort of different scenarios, right? Eyal formulated an agenda which I found personally very inspiring, that in a practice of forensic architecture, there are three moments. There is the field, the lab, and the forum, right? So we can start with the research in the field. We can create a kind of a scientific hypothesis, perhaps, in the lab, let's say, working with the scientists and so on. And then there is the forum, right? And for forensic architecture, it is the idea of the public truth, right? So another kind of truth is established, right? So I think for us, I believe in architecture, the kind of the question that I often ask myself is how do we produce new narratives that become the ways through which we are able to design, right? How do we reassemble the histories or the narratives of design, right? In the light of those new histories, right? Of the natural or of the urban, of the, biological, of the interaction of human and animal and so on, all those important questions. So I want to ask you perhaps together with Marc, or my way of asking this question is where do you find that your work has the most clear kind of design aspect, right? Where do you intervene with a kind of a proposal, how to do, how to make, how to... Where is it not about visibility, it's not about revealing, it's really about, putting an idea on the table. Shall we do it like this?
Sure. I'll still remain within the Natural History Museum, though. But I think it's a manner of how to work together in our case. Because there's, in this dense situation, sociological situation, there's the activists, there's artists who have a very strong research-led practice in the field, in the collections, with aesthetic means. And then there are the scientific curators and the institutional directors, as well as who funds the project. So we are funded by the German federal cultural foundation, right? And so there's an intense proposition of how to work together in shaping and making institutions, which I think is a design project. It's a design problem, and the question is, the institutions that we have don't work in the world that we are kind of grappling with. They are made for a different kind of world that we don't have anymore. And so our very concrete project and the outcome of the show that you can go and look at is just one output for a public, but there's this interior process of trying to find other modes of working together and working with very institutional bodies and very institutional people, and kind of opening that up and making something that lasts. That is, it's not just for this exercise, but the kind of project is that creates a different scene, and a kind of a lasting imprint of how we need to do these things differently.
No, I'm really happy because you're like now kind of pushed, as we would say in Serbo-Croatian, you're pushing water on my watermill. Because I've been like, I have a feeling the last few talks I was invited to give, I ended up with saying, can we as an architects, when I confine under architect, the one who thinks from interior to territorial scale, think that we can apply our way of thinking of designing institutions. And I think this is one way of going, which also does not mean burn them to the ground and start them completely new, which would be a modernist way to do, but actually to really go and trying to find the ways of reassembling them. And in that context, I think that the platform you gave to Paulo to develop this project is also points to one of the projective ways in which they are using institutional framework which exists to protect European heritage from being destroyed by the capitalist urbanization of the cities and the nature, because the conservation of nature starts in the moment when in the US they realize, oh, we almost we reached the other coast, maybe we should protect some of the nature and the whole natural part. And then they say, okay, let's take what we have as institutional formats and try to make it work tactically for other things. And I think that this also works because Paulo is an architect, because we as those who are the only profession trained to think what happens in space in the reaction, on this level of interaction between human, we can also bring in connection what's the spatial consequences of something that no one thought about has a spatial consequence. Mm-hmm. So how can we even take the worst things such as public-private partnership and make it into something that works for the public, as rethink it as civil-public partnership, for example? Because we can do this. It's relatively easy to rewrite the law for this to be recognized as an institution. So this is more of a comment than a question.
Great. Yeah, we'll have to do it, Marc, the new institutions of territorial governance and how to reinvent them. And for sure, we will have that lecture series coming up sometime soon. Right. Exactly. The topic will be law. I agree.
No, technology.
Oh, but there is no.
No, indeed. So we will take a couple of questions from the audience. Thanks.
Where's the audience?
Thank you for the lecture. And I would like to ask that, in your opinion, the concept of coexistence between human and nature, is it different from the concept of human as part of nature? And would that lead us to the different way of creation of our behavior, our creation of art, architecture, and built environment?
Thanks for your question. So the coexistence, did you read the text? Yeah, okay, nice. So that's a provocation also, right? In that particular context, I was asked to write for the glossary of the Mao catalog, which was different terms, and I got coexistence, and then I was prompted to think about that. So first of all, you said, is it humans and nature within nature? And so I would put that back to you, kind of after what I spoke about. The term nature and human already can be problematized so much in so many different ways, in the sense of asking what is a human versus nature, where does this distinction come from historically in a kind of Western discourse, what are other ways of situating life forms, human life within more than human kind of ecosystems. So yes, of course, coexistence means kind of rethinking our relationship to the more than human world, in that kind of also in the context of that essay. But as a provocation, it's to initiate a kind of questioning of the conceptual terms that we use, that we don't even kind of question, and do that kind of work on the concept level, and then see how you can reinstantiate that differently. And then as an architect or as a designer, I don't know. That would then, when you do that work, I think it leads you to a sort of possibility for your practice where, a kind of, if you want that, a kind of integrity of your position to where you want to intervene, how you want to make an impact, how you work out that kind of set of questions. Vague, but I hope productive nonetheless. Yeah?
Maybe I can ask a question. I was thinking about this, of course, from an architect's point of view, and the buildings that these things are shown in, because they're often these cathedrals of this natural history. You know where it is in New York, you know where it is in every city, and they represent these things that you basically try to reassemble or rethink. And I was wondering whether your work is intrinsically linked to this kind of thing, that you have to go into the existing and attack it or reframe it, or if maybe you could, or do you see any kind of, maybe it's not tabula rasa, and I hope it's not the snail kind of proposal of a museum, but maybe would that defy your argument in a way that you would produce spaces through this new way of looking, or do you really need the friction of the existing?
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that.
And
question
hopefully,
too.
yeah, I mean, there would be other ways than making a snail-shaped museum, of course, but the spaces that you actually occupy with this kind of new perspective, I mean, that would be maybe something that you could think about as an architect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I go out of your question and then I come back in. The image that I showed of the London Natural History Museum is exactly this kind of paradigmatic church or non-secular church for evolution, which then changes the worldview entirely. And why I showed that particular image is because historically Wallace made a drawing before this architecture was built, which kind of pre-imagines already that shape. So for us on the sort of research level, that's why this particular image then makes sense. So that's just a side note. And then practically I can answer it in one way. We did an exhibition precursing to the German cycle in Jakarta in 2015, where we also worked with the scientists of the Indonesian Institute of Science. But we made an exhibition project in a contemporary art space, a very political space in Jakarta, Komunitas Salihara. And we were able to loan, in that case, scientific specimens and bring them into an art institution. And that did a completely different thing to the specimens and to the kind of discourse and the questions that we were then working through there, because we didn't have that sort of institutional baggage, you could literally call it, of the Natural History Museum as the site against which we were kind of chiseling, right? So it is not at all in this work a precondition. It's an interesting one to be doing, but I think we're also now finished with that cycle and we're doing other things. So then to take that kind of entirely out of that narrow circle in the work, there's, like I said earlier, sometimes it becomes a book, sometimes becomes a discussion. The sort of the rendering in the space of ideas and space of architectural setting often depends on what makes sense for a particular thing. And then since we don't have an institution ourselves that we're also bound to and making a regular program in that one institution, we can always reframe what particular kind of set makes sense. And then sometimes, with the book series that we added, it then becomes a pre-stage for an exhibition. So there's also this working through different spaces.
Thank you, Sasha. I want to thank you, and we should finish now and continue after this session. I mean, I can just say what a kind of a great subversion, because we wanted to discuss about Anthropocene and ecology, and let's say ask ourselves how those to say so, environmental agenda could help us rethink our own discipline. And I think, you are telling us, well, actually we have to rewrite the whole natural history in order to arrive to that. So I can, with that, I can say, well, watch closely, Anna-Sophie, because that work is hugely important for our discipline as well, and for our understanding what ecology and what Anthropocene might be in the way that they will inform our design practices, right? And I think I find it also really inspiring to think about the Nature History Museum as a kind of a site of conceptual battle, where we will find kind of important messages for ourselves. I have a little daughter, so I think we might go the next weekend to Basel to visit that place that will be soon closed. So thank you very much. Thank you, Anna-Sophie, for a great talk. Thank you, Dubravka, for a great discussion. It's a pleasure to have you both. And thank you, dear audience. So see you very soon. Next week.